Hello, welcome back to my channel. I'm Kat, this is Kat Makes, and today is a super exciting day because it is day one of the Learn Tambour Embroidery series. I have been looking forward to making this series for approximately forever, and I finally have all the pieces gathered and we're ready to get started. This video is going to be a little bit of an introduction. I'm going to tell you all the supplies that you need, and we're actually going to go through how to form the first stitch in the next video, which will give you a chance to gather all your supplies and get anything that you don't have and sort of set yourself up, right? But before we get started with our supply list, I want to tell you a little bit about my own history with Tambour embroidery because I feel like it sort of helps set the context. I've been sewing for about 23 years, but I've been making all of my own clothes exclusively, so not buying any ready-to-wear at all since 2016. And in 2017, I started working on my wedding dress. And it was actually through my wedding dress how I found Tambour embroidery. I didn't actually start out to learn Tambour embroidery. I was looking for the best way of applying beads to the bodice of my wedding dress. And best is an interesting word to use in this context, but what I was trying to figure out is if there was a way to apply beads that didn't involve picking up a bead with a needle and stitching it on, and then going back and picking up another bead and stitching it on. And I was doing all of this research to figure out the way that I wanted to apply these beads to my wedding dress bodice, and I finally found Tambour embroidery. I have blogged extensively about the making of my wedding dress, which actually turned out to be my very first ever Tambour embroidery project. So you can go read those blog posts if you would like on katmakes.com. I'll put some links down below for you. But basically what happened is I completely fell in love with Tambour embroidery, finished my wedding dress. It was amazing, had so much fun. And I was so sad when I finished my wedding dress that I didn't have any other Tambour embroidery projects to work on, so I started another one. I worked on a frocktails dress that has this beautiful beaded overlay that sort of mimics the pattern that's on the fabric. I made an Art Deco inspired top and also a flapper dress, headbands, purses, all kinds of little accessories. I ended up having a couple of international teaching opportunities, which is really exciting, and the rest is kind of history. Tambour embroidery can be kind of frustrating to learn because you're teaching your hands and fingers to move in ways that they haven't moved before, and there's a lot of sort of fine motor skill that needs to be developed in order to create the stitch. But once you get it and once you have it, that beautiful rhythm is a lot like knitting or crochet, where it's just very relaxing to sit down and work on an embroidery. And I just love it so much, and I'm here to share it with you, and that's enough about me talking about myself. Let's get into the supply list. First, we're going to talk about whatever you use to hold your fabric. So there's two ways to go here. You can use a slate frame or you can use an embroidery hoop. I'm going to show you the slate frame first. Mine is a little bit too big to fit in the frame, but I will pop a little photo up so that you can kind of see what she looks like in situ. But basically we have these shorter bars and a crossbar, and our fabric is mounted using twill tape. The slate frame is by far the best way to go, but they are very expensive and can be very hard to find. When I learned Tambour embroidery in 2017, there were no slate frames available in New Zealand, which is where I live. So I could either spend many dollars on international shipping and have one sent, or I could make it myself. And I ended up making my own. There are a lot more options now. You can look on Amazon. There's one from Laces. I'll add some links below for you. But when you're just starting out, embroidery hoops are totally fine. So here are some. They've got a thin one and a thick one. So this is like a regular embroidery hoop. This is just bamboo. And I've actually wrapped the inner hoop of this with twill tape. The purpose of the twill tape is just to give it a little bit more grip, especially when you're dealing with a thin sheer fabric, which we're often dealing with for Tambour embroidery. It helps just to grip onto that fabric a little bit more. If you can, and you don't already have an embroidery hoop, you're looking at buying one, I like these quilters hoops. They are thicker, and therefore you're going to get more surface area to grip onto that thinner sheer fabric. And again, just wrap the inside with some twill tape. This is 1/2" twill tape, just to give it a little bit more grip. So these are totally fine starting out. The issue with using hoops long term, the reason I like my slate frame and the reason slate frames are more preferable is because the fabric does tend to loosen up in a hoop over time, especially if you're using, again, the sheer fabric. And the slate frame is actually pinned in place, so there's nowhere for it to go. So that's bonus point number one for a slate frame. Bonus point number two is you can actually move your fabric around on a slate frame without having to worry about beads getting crunched in between the two layers of the hoop, right? So if you're working on a beaded piece that is larger than the hoop, you basically can't use the hoop, because when you go to shift it, so that you shift it to the left so you can work more on the right, you're going to end up with this section where the beads are getting squished in the hoop that either you'll squish it so much the beads will break, or it will affect the tension of your fabric. So totally fine when you're starting out. Just do a little sampler that fits inside your hoop. If you decide you love Tambour embroidery, go the slate frame route because it's a lot better in a lot of ways. Next up, we have the Tambour Embroidery tool. Now, this is sometimes called Tambour Embroidery tool. It can be called a Tambour Embroidery hook or a Tambour Embroidery needle. They look like this. This is just two options that I have here. We've got two different parts to this tool. So we've got the handle, which is this bit right there, and on the end of the handle we have this little brass end with a knob. So the little brass part at the end is called the ferrule, and then the ferrule has a knob. I'm going to get to why that's important in the next video where we talk about forming the stitch and setting up our hook. But what's important is you have a handle end and then you have your little business end, which looks like a teeny tiny needle, except that teeny tiny needle has an even teenier tiny hook on the end of it. If you're familiar with crochet, it looks just like an absolutely itty bitty crochet hook the size of a sewing needle. And what's fascinating about that is that it actually is a sewing needle. So these hooks that we use for Tambour embroidery are actually sewing machine needles for a special type of machine called a Cornelli machine, which does a chain stitch on an actual machine. That's mostly just a fun fact that I like to share because I love all the little connective threads between all of these different hobbies. But it is actually important because these needles are sized the same way that machine needles are sized. So the smallest size, which is actually what's in this hook right now, is a 70, and they go up in increments of 10. So 70, 80, 90, 100, 110, and 120. Those are the sizes of Tambour embroidery hooks that you'll come across. Usually when you're buying a set, a Tambour embroidery handle, it will come with 3 different needles, and they're either going to skew on the smaller side or the larger side. The smaller ones, especially the size 70, is what you want to get if you're mainly working on beads, and I'm going to tell you why later. Just keep that in your brain for now. If you're mainly wanting to work with beads, get the smaller set and make sure it has a size 70 needle in it. If you're mainly wanting to work with decorative embroidery threads, silk threads, metallic threads, those kinds of things, skew a little bit larger and see if you can get a 110 or a 120 size. Those are going to be better for dealing with those thicker threads. Again, I'll get into the details of why in future videos. This is just the overview. Next up, you're going to need some beads and some sequins. The opportunities are pretty endless here, and if you're working with what you've got, hopefully you already have an embroidery hoop in your house, and maybe you have some seed beads sticking around from some past hobbies, right? I like to work with size 11 seed beads, and I like to buy the ones that come pre-strung on a hank. But if you have some seed beads around, like loose ones like this, totally fine. You just are also going to need a bead needle to string them so that you can work with them, because we are going to be working with pre-strung beads for at least one version of what I'm going to show you in our future videos. So I mentioned I like to work with size 11 beads. You can also get size 10s, which are slightly larger. Some people prefer those. And the other size that I find that are quite fun, especially for teeny tiny little details, are the 15s. Some people think that those are way too small. Size 11 is a nice, lovely, even middle ground. Similarly, sequins come pre-strung as well. So this is a little snake of sequins, and you can see there, if I just open them, like separate them a little bit, those little sequins, and they just sit on that string. You can also get loose sequins as well. Those look like that. And again, you may or may not have sequins laying around your house from past hobbies. If you do, just use whatever you have to practice. The thing is, you're not going to know what your preferences are until you actually start working with Tambour embroidery and forming the stitch and seeing what sort of textures and styles and patterns you like. So you won't really know what to buy up front, and I'd rather you spent your money on things you were actually going to use than buy a whole bunch of stuff that you're not sure about and it actually turns out that you like, I don't know, bigger beads and smaller sequins or something like that. If you don't have any beads or sequins to try, see if you can find like a small assortment set at a craft store that has a bunch of different colors and sizes, just to sort of test it out and see what you like. The last thing on our Tambour embroidery supply list is fabric. If you take one thing away from this video, listen to me very closely. If you take one thing away from this video, please, 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 please learn Tambour embroidery on organza. There's a lot of stuff out in the world about tulle as a really good fabric for Tambour embroidery, and tulle does have its benefits. It doesn't unravel. If you're going to use it for applique, you can trim really close around those edges and you don't have to worry about any sort of fraying or anything like that. But the thing about organza, and the reason that organza is a preferred base for Tambour embroidery in so many different couture houses around the world, is that it's really, really stable, right? So I can stretch it as hard as I possibly can, and it's not going to give this way, and it's also not going to give this way, right? There's no stretch. It's really, really strong. You can stretch the ever-loving daylights out of this in your hoop, and when you take it out of the hoop, it's going to maintain that shape, right? It's not going to pucker. Whereas with a tulle, here, I'll show you. Here's a piece of tulle, right? It has a relatively stable direction, right? So I can stretch it a teeny tiny little bit. You can see it kind of giving just a little bit in that direction, and I can stretch it loads in this direction, right? So what will happen when I stretch this very tightly in my hoop or in my slate frame or whatever, and I bead it, and I add these beads that are a specific shape, I take it out of the hoop and it's going to shrink back up to that original size that it was before I stretched it out, and it's going to pucker. And you're going to be very sad, okay? The other thing that makes organza a really good fabric, aside from the lack of stretch, is because it's so strong. When you're stitching, especially when you're just learning, the tighter stretched the fabric is in your hoop, the easier it's going to be for you to form the stitch without accidentally snagging the fabric. As the fabric gets looser, the tendency for the hook to snag on the fabric gets higher, right? You can absolutely use tulle, but you're going to have it stretched not as tight so that you don't get the puckers. But if you have it stretched not as tight, it's going to be more difficult for you to form the stitches, which is why I say tulle is an absolutely fine fabric to use for tambour embroidery, but please, 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 not while you're learning, okay? Once you understand the tension requirements and once you understand the basic stitch on organza, then you can graduate to tulle, okay? I would also prefer, if you can, that you use silk organza because it has the capacity to be steamed into shape a little bit, especially if you're working on something for a garment or something beyond basic test. But I know that silk organza is outside of some people's price range, so if that's the case, polyester organza is still leaps and bounds better than any kind of tulle. Before we finish off this video for today, I'm going to leave you with some instruction on the setup. So the thing about tambour embroidery is that you need both your hands to be free because we're going to be holding onto the tulle with one hand and our thread with the other hand. So we don't have any hands left to hold on to our hoop or our slate frame. When I'm working with my slate frame, I like to just prop it up between two tables. You can get like little stands to support your slate frame so that both of your hands are free. If you're using a hoop, you have a couple of different options. The first option is you can get these little legs. So I've got 3 of them here, and the little leg just clamps onto your embroidery hoop like this. You get 3 or 4 of them, and then you pop that down on a table and you've effectively created a little table stand out of your hoop, right? So that's option 1. Option 2 is any kind of other embroidery hoop holder. So this is one that I made. Actually, there's a tutorial on my blog for how I did this, but it's got a little base stand that I can pop under my leg if I want to, or clamp to a table, and then the embroidery hoop fits in here, and then all of this is adjustable as well. Working backwards in order of complexity, you can actually create a stand out of just a table if you have a C-clamp. It's my little C-clamp. I got this from just a local hardware store. I'm just going to tilt you guys down a little bit so that you can see this next one. So here's my embroidery hoop. We're just going to set it on our table here, and we're going to use the C-clamp to just clamp that right on, just over the top of the embroidery hoop, just like this. And that allows for the majority of the hoop to be hanging off the edge of the table, and we can work in this area and then just move the hoop around when we need to get to a different location. Finally, if you don't have a C-clamp, there's one other thing that you can do. I have to move you guys a little bit more so that I can show you this one. So we've got our hoop again, and we want it to be hanging off the edge of the table, but we don't have a C-clamp. But what we do have is a copy of Principles of Anatomy and Physiology, the 13th edition, or any other heavy textbook will do. And all you have to do is set that off the edge of the table, and clamp your hoop to your table just like that. You are going to have to buy a tambour embroidery tool for this. There's no way to learn tambour embroidery unless you have the tambour embroidery tool. Hopefully you have an embroidery hoop hanging around your house somewhere. Hopefully you have a couple of beads and sequins to give this a try, and a heavy book. But my goal here is to encourage you to use what you have to try and see if you like tambour embroidery, rather than spending all your money up front on something that you end up hating. But then once you know that you love tambour embroidery as much as I love tambour embroidery, then you can go out and spend all your money. Unfortunately, there's no way around that part. Thanks so much for watching the very first episode of my Learn Tambour Embroidery series. I hope you did learn something. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or specific things that you'd like to see as part of this series, or even as a Q&A afterwards. If you want to see more of what I'm up to and see what that recent project I've got going on in my slate frame is, check out Instagram and TikTok. I am cat.makes in both places, and you can also find my blog, catmakes.com. And of course, make sure you're subscribed right here on YouTube so you don't miss the next installment in the series. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!